Justin A.W. Blair here, writer, painter, broadcaster, with another review. This time's a deep cut. We're going deep cut into 1980s kind of obscure fantasy. Obscure to me, anyway. Perhaps I'm simply a dilettante. I'm not sure. I don't think so. This is Taltos by Steven Brust. Brust. Not really sure. He is checked a little Wikipedia action out on him beforehand because I had never heard of him. That's the thing. I didn't run up upon it, but I happened upon a cache, not really sure which, of old Ace paperbacks, fantasy and science fiction. And I thought to myself, you know what? I have a YouTube channel. I'm going to crack some of these open, check them out. Some of the authors I've never heard of, I don't know about. I want to see what 1980s fantasy was like. First, a caveat. This is apparently number 4 in a series of books that Mr. Brust has been writing for quite some time. So everything I say, it's possible if there's some huge Steven Brust fans out there of this series that I'm missing something because I didn't start from number 1. I had no idea. I just grabbed me a big old bunch of paperbacks and headed for the door after I appropriately paid for them. Checked out a little Wikipedia action on the man. He's been writing for a long time. Never really heard of him before, like I said. I mean, the name didn't even ring a bell whatsoever. Hungarian guy. Not really Hungarian. I mean, he's born in America, but it mentions that. And I guess because the character is named Vlad Taltos, I've been to Hungary before and Romania quite a bit. The name Taltos, which is the last name of this character, sounds a little bit like Vlad Tepes. So we have Vlad Taltos. There's a ring there anyway, right? Even though he's a Hungarian, but that's a whole thing we won't get into between the talking about the claims on Transylvania between the Hungarians and the Romanians. This is not a poli-sci podcast. This isn't a place for that. It's a place for fantasy. I could be missing something from this. Keep that in mind with my review of this book. And I want to say first off that despite some of the negative things I'm going to say about this book, there are positive things about it too. And I don't regret reading it. I enjoyed it. Actually, first off, very short, 175 pages. Not a big time sink in comparison to modern fantasy books, which oftentimes are at least 500 pages. And that's good. Also, the pacing of the book is very quick. And that's not just a matter of the author being brutal in the pacing, which, as you may know if you've been watching my channel, I've been reviewing a lot of Star Trek books. And in that case, oftentimes the pacing is quick but brutal. This is actually done really well in a lot of ways because the passages are short, the chapters are short, but he is really good at capturing one little scene or one exchange of dialogue in a very short passage and making it hit and making it meaningful to the reader. But also structurally, what he does in this book is, well, let's back up for a second. As many of you know, I am a writer, and so a lot of times when I'm looking at these books, I'm thinking about them from the perspective of a writer. I don't like long commercials in the middle of a YouTube video, so I'll get to the point quick. My own novel, written by me, Justin A.W. Blair, entitled The Haunt on the Island of Esmer, is out, available on Amazon. You can buy it in ebook or paperback format. It is inspired by Malazan, A Song of Ice and Fire, and The Black Company. Epic novels in that vein. Take a moment, check it out. But let me back up just a little bit and give you a general outline of what we're dealing with here. We're in a fantasy world, and this is a first-person point of view, so we're right with the main character, Vlad Taltos, who is basically a criminal. He's an assassin who is also a magician, but not a sorcerer, or perhaps he knows a little bit of both, I'm not sure, but mainly I think he does magic. I think he can do both, but the thing is, he is a human, but that's called an Easterner in this book. He's kind of an immigrant into the land of what is essentially elves, but they're called something different here. He's a criminal, though. That is one thing that I'll get back to it later in the review that is a problem. But broad overview, he goes on an adventure in essence. But we're also getting a rehashing of his early childhood and kind of what made him the way he is. And while I think that that is done fairly well, it's done really well on a structural level. The way that each chapter begins with what is essentially a magical rite, which he is performing, that doesn't come to fruition until the end of the book. We don't know that though, but that's a very short paragraph or two. But then we also have interspersed within the main narrative his childhood and the way he grew up. It's just done really well. The way that all these different things are layered, it's done well, and it never ever snags. It never snags you and holds you back. I looked up the Wikipedia of this guy. He looks like someone I would meet at a Renaissance fair, except I've never been to a Renaissance fair. And that, in and of itself, is magical. There is something which I'm not sure about yet. I'm not sure if it has to do with late 1980s fantasy or if it's simply the author's tone, or maybe it's just the tone of this one book. It has a Gen X feel to it. It's not quite grimdark, but it has a very low register, and it is annoyingly cynical in the way that the character perceives his surroundings. And I get the sense that that is also partially maybe the author's perspective as well. And I won't say it takes us out of the world, but because to a degree the world here is not constructed elaborately enough or with enough depth to really pull us out very far, because we don't go very far into it. And that brings me to something about fantasy. When I read fantasy, I want to be transported into this world. Now, some people will call that escapism. I'd like to suggest that that's not exactly right. Escapism has a kind of negative feel to it. But when I read literature, when you, dear listener, dear watcher, dear viewer, read literature, you also want to be transported into a world. It may not be a secondary world, even though technically, if the characters are fictitious, it kind of is. So I don't really see the desire to escape or to teleport into another world as being exclusively something that is wrong with genre writing. That's a separate topic and a bigger topic, perhaps. But I say that because while this book does move you ahead and move you through it, and it does seem thought out, the problem is that our main character, Vlad Taltos, basically talks and acts like an Italian mafia figure, but also kind of a cynical Gen Xer. And this has to do with register. I call it that. I don't even know if that's the right word. And it's a difficult thing to accomplish in a fantasy. In terms of dialogue in particular, how do you have people in a fantasy world speak to one another? Well, the author decided to basically just have, there are some words that I wrote down here. He uses words like a zillion and gosh. And what are some of the others? Gosh, a zillion. There's another particular one that really bothered me, but it's really throughout. I mean, the his familiar, which is basically a small dragon-like creature, calls him boss, and he calls the other people in the kind of mafia boss. It's very odd. There's this basically just kind of generic view of what the Italian mafia would be like, and that informs the language and the way people talk. And so I would call that a low register, an extremely low register. I mean, in a way, kind of the lowest of the low. Now, you don't necessarily need to have people, you can make different mistakes, right? In fantasy, you can reach for an extremely high register where you're basically like putting a lot of archaisms in, or you're trying to make someone sound like they're from Elizabethan England, or even trying to make them sound like they're from Beowulf. And you can use these and thys and thines and all that kind of stuff, like King James Bible style. That can be done, I suppose, but it's hard to do that too. Very difficult to do that. So it's difficult for fantasy writers to find the correct register. The register deals with not only dialogue, but also with the narrative voice. We're getting a little bit expansive here on this review of Taltos, but these are things that came to mind while reading it. And ultimately, what happens is when you make your character sound like an Italian jabroni mafia guy, you know, there's only so far you can be transported into that secondary world when that's constantly bringing you back to the real world. I have extensive notes on this one, actually, which I did not expect was going to happen. But it brought so much to mind to me. I don't want to belabor it, but the problem is that when you decide as a writer to go with a very low register in terms of voice and dialogue, meta ironical thing going on based off that choice, a kind of wink to the reader. Now, he doesn't fall quite into that trap, but the humor, all of that, it feels like it doesn't feel like a fantasy character. Subverting fantasy tropes is certainly something a lot of us know about that read the genre. This does it, but because of the choices of tone. I actually think that the author probably could, though I'm guessing, could have made different choices. Because there are passages in here that while the prose isn't particularly elegant or moving, there is some emotional resonance that the author taps into with the character, particularly with his um, remembrances of the way his grandfather raised him. And there are some moments in the setting where you get the sense of wonder, which many of us want from a fantasy book. So I think the author was capable, but simply decided to make a choice, and that's his choice to make. It reads fast, it reads fun. There is, and this is something that I don't know enough about yet either. You can leave in the comments if you like your opinion about this, but there is a very Dungeons and Dragons feel to the fights, which aren't particularly bloody, but are well, they're not gruesome. They are bloody, and the murders that occur, and there are actually quite a few murders, not just fights, because the main character is an assassin, and he's alongside the main narrative. We're looking back towards many of his assassinations. It's not grimdark, like I say, but the violence itself, and this is a problem I have with fantasy and science fiction, how violence is dealt with. If you're going to go into it, I feel like, especially when your main character is an assassin, there's a kind of half measure way that it's done here. Though, to be fair, he does make the character unrepetitive. Unrepetitive. Okay, so what he does here is kind of interesting. The character is not unlikable, but he is not repetitive. That is a weird word to say instead of a word to read. There's a lot of words you read and then you try to say them, and you're like, that sounds weird. There's no sense of repentance on the part of the character, which then leads to this kind of, again, nihilistic, kind of cynical outlook. Though it's handled fairly well because he does stick to it. And the people that he's assassinating, for the most part, or almost entirely, are other criminals, in essence. So, but it feels like a crime novel, I guess, more than a fantasy in all this. So, a note on the actual fighting scenes as opposed to the murder scenes, the assassination scenes. There is this general, and I've never actually played Dungeons and Dragons. A friend of mine is a dungeon master, and I'm fairly well immersed in the atmosphere, I guess you would say, of it from playing video games that owe some debt to Dungeons and Dragons. But magic and the way it's handled in terms of fighting is what I wrote down as a kind of what do I say, air and sparkles. Like there are sorcerers and wizards that are basically have wands in their hand and sparks fly off and a little bit of fire and this and that. It's not particularly delved into enough. It's not bad. It feels almost retro to me, so in that sense, it's enjoyable. But I don't think again that it lends a lot of depth to it. Though there is the idea of teleporting, and that's handled actually fairly well here. Let's call that sorcery and sorcery fighting for a second, though, and differentiate that because within the text itself there is a differentiation between magic and sorcery. The depiction of magic is actually done well because it's not done with a great deal of specificity, but it does feel like a dude who goes to the Renaissance fair and does magic. That's the best way to put it. Um, because one of my friends is also that kind of guy. What do I mean by this? I mean there's kind of herbs and candles and ceremonial daggers and whatnot, but it feels like what you would assume somebody who's a Wiccan or something like that, or a neo pagan, like it kind of does actually catch the sense of what they do in their magical rituals. So that's good. It's real, but again, it feels real more towards our own world as opposed to a secondary world which we are supposed to be delving into. It's too close to our own world. That's the thing. That depiction of kind of magic over a bowl of water or whatever, and then a bunch of Italian jabroni talk. It just constantly is bringing us back to our own world as opposed to letting us get into that other world. This kind of cynical feeling, which makes sense to a degree because this guy's an assassin, though relatively young. There's a passage where it's like they've entered the land of the dead, and there's a geography. This is one of the great things about fantasy. A new geography to explore through the text, and it just feels a little lazy. It's like I think Vlad asks the character, "Does this river have a name?" And the character answers, "Blood River." And Vlad says, "I thought so." And it's kind of done with this wink and smirk. It's an attempt at comedy, and a comedy which might have felt a little fresher in 1988 or whenever this was written. Yeah, again, some more words that are used in the text. Crap. Again, they refer to one another as boss. What the blazes is another phrase. It just does not work for me in a fantasy at all. I can see it, and I'm guessing maybe it was a kind of reflexive action against the super high fantasy and the legacy of Tolkien and how that permeated so much of fantasy, and maybe some of these authors trying to kind of rebel against that a little bit and find their own voice, find their own ability to tell a story with a different tone. And I can respect that. And I don't think it was done poorly. It's just not ultimately what I want in fantasy. Though I was more than happy to read this and enjoyed it while I did. That being said, the fact that it was 175 pages probably is the only reason I'm saying that. If it was 300 plus pages, I think that this would have started to irritate me a lot more. So maybe this only works maybe you can only get away with this in a very short volume. I think that's my instinct about that, thinking about this. I'm thinking it through as I'm talking to you. There's two other kind of big ideas here that, while not presented as particularly large ideas in the book, as I started to think about it, I think are large ideas. And again, there's a kind of sidestepping these things, maybe for brevity's sake, but I have a inkling of a thought that is perhaps because the author just didn't want to deal with it. Now, the first of these is the idea of a weapon which destroys not only the body but the soul. And this is a theme you'll see in fantasy. You'll be familiar with it. And I asked myself, why is that? Why does that work? Why is it used in fantasy? Why is it here? It does two things here. And again, I'm trying not to actually give away the plot of this in case you want to read it. It's short, and I actually would suggest it's a fun, small read and not a bad thing to read, but this won't matter in terms of plot. In essence, there is a type of blade, dagger, knife, a type of weapon set, I think called Morganti, which not only kills the body but kills the soul. Well, what does this do for us? Why employ this in fantasy? I started to think about it as I wrote my notes. And I thought to myself, one thing it does do is it tells us, without having to depict it in detail, it tells us that in this secondary world, there is such a thing as a soul, or at least the belief in it, but more than just the belief in it. There is a soul. Hold on to that thought and let it merge with the second point I want to make. I think I won't go too in depth on either of these, but let you consider them. There are gods in this book, and the POV character and a small band, basically him, one other person, and his familiar, have to go into the land of the dead and ultimately address the gods. Depicting the gods in a fantasy book, God or the gods, in a secondary world, is extraordinarily difficult to do really well. Brust decides to do a couple things here. The description of them is actually done really well. It's brief, but I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the setting as well of the gods. But there is, first off, a suggestion that the gods are not really gods. They are mortals that have ascended to that status through the use of maybe sorcery or this, that, and the other thing. It's left vague. Maybe it's actually explained more in other books in the series, but for me, it's left vague here. That's stepping back from it, calling them gods, saying this secondary world believes in this pantheon of gods, but I'm here to write and to show you, oh, they're not really gods. I find that a choice which can be characterized as lazy and maybe even a little cowardly, though I won't accuse this author particularly of doing that because I don't know what his intentions are, especially in the broader series. But when that is done, when the gods in a secondary world are considered, that there's almost a scientific reason for their existence, or a way to use reason, capital R, to explain their existence, that is in essence the same thing as an atheistic secondary world. And then we have a problem, because we have a world in which supposedly there is a body and soul, and there is a magical weapon or a set of weapons which can destroy the soul. But then, when presented the pantheon of gods in the secondary world, we're told, well, they're just kind of potentially a more elevated type of human. something about that doesn't quite work. Taltos by Steven Brust. What I would suggest, and if I happen upon some other paperbacks from him and they're of roughly the same page length, I actually would pick up another one to check it out. It was kind of an enjoyable read. I One thing I really miss is the art from the 1980s and even going into the 1990s for even the most slim of paperbacks. It looks like some effort was put into this, and it's not bad actually. I enjoy that. I enjoy the font here of Taltos. I enjoyed the book. I actually would recommend it for all of its faults. I found it very enjoyable. One thing that it does is it ends very abruptly. And so